Hi all, it's great to see you all. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I think that we can go ahead and get started. Whether it's the morning, afternoon, or evening for you, thank you for taking time out of your Friday to be with us today. My name is Lauren Reese. I'm joining the Environmental Peacebuilding Conference from Washington, D.C., where I direct the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. I'm joined today by my colleagues Amanda King, Sherry Goodman, and Cynthia Brady, our partner at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Roger Pulwarty, and Ileana Monterosa from the Climate Land Use Alliance. I'm going to give their quick bios before we get to the discussion. I also want to give you a quick reminder that as participants in this conference, you have agreed to the Code of Conduct and Anti-Harassment and Anti-Discrimination Agreement that I think Joe has just posted in the chat. Amanda King is the Program Associate for the Environmental Change and Security Program and has been helping to lead the project we're going to be talking about today since its earliest inception. Sherry Goodman is a senior fellow with the Wilson Center and has been a longtime leader in environmental security, including as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. Cynthia Brady is a global fellow with the Wilson Center. She was previously a senior peacebuilding and conflict advisor on environment, climate, conflict, and peace at USAID, and before that at the State Department. And Roger Pulwarty is the senior scientist in the in NOAA's Physical Sciences Laboratory. He's an advisor on early warning and adaptation to national and international agencies, including the UN, the Organization of American States, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Ileana Monterosa is a Guatemalan environmental scientist. She's a research associate with the Center for International Forestry Research, also a consultant for the Mexico and Central American Resilience Initiative led by the Climate and Land Use Alliance. I introduced them because you're going to be hearing from them first before we get to the discussion, but this is really meant to be a roundtable discussion. And so I hope that you all will participate, whether it's coming off of mute and showing your face or asking questions in the chat box. I'll be following the chat as closely as possible to incorporate any discussion or questions that come up there, but please do chime in and raise your hand. Today's session builds on an ongoing project, improving predictive capabilities for climate security risks, that the Wilson Center is leading with NOAA and the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Our goal in hosting this roundtable is threefold. First, we want to share the framework we've developed for understanding how climate change interacts with existing vulnerabilities to drive risk and how this understanding can help us identify entry points for more effective responses. Second, we'll share what we're learning through the application of this framework to the migration and violence connections in the context of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And third, we hope to tap into the depth and breadth of knowledge in the environmental peacebuilding community to further sharpen the application of this framework. To that end, we welcome your insights, your expertise, your questions, and your perspectives in today's discussion. We'll start by sharing the project's findings to date, and then open the discussion up to everyone here today. I'm going to share some quick background on the project, then turn it over to Amanda King, who will give an overview of the framework we've developed to better understanding how climate interacts with existing vulnerabilities to drive risk, and how a better understanding of these pathways of risk and help us to shape more effective responses. From there, we'll hear very brief comments from Cynthia, Sherry, Roger, and Ileana. So there's clear evidence that extreme weather, water, and climate events pose critical security risks to communities around the world, to national security and global stability. From destabilizing droughts and food security in Africa to devastating hurricanes and flooding in the United States and an altering and melting Arctic landscape, we are seeing an increase in not only the frequency and severity of these events, but also their physical, social, and economic impacts. A number of US government agencies, including the National Intelligence Council, have outlined the national security implications of current risks and anticipated environmental changes. Understanding these risks, anticipating them, and developing better coordination across US government agencies, multilateral institutions, regional institutions, and partners on the ground has become a key priority for the US government, first under President Obama and now under President Biden. But what does this look like in practice? Frankly, it requires a fairly significant shift in how we assess risk in decision-making processes and who is at the table. So a few years ago, in partnership with NOAA and UCAR, the Wilson Center undertook an effort to develop an evidence-based interagency framework to understand the risk pathways and to develop guidance for decision-making that brings together climate science and contextual understanding. So I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, who will share more about the framework we've developed. Over to you, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Lauren. And I'm just going to share my screen, have a quick presentation. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. It's really nice to see familiar names and new names, and I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. And we're in the final session, so home stretch. So as Lauren mentioned, I'm going to give a brief overview of our framework and where we're at with the project to date. So to reiterate, in response to this growing recognition that Lauren mentioned that climate change poses critical security risks, since 2017, the Wilson Center has partnered with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, to develop a framework for better improving predictive capabilities for the security risks posed by a changing climate. The overall goal of the project was to build an evidence-based framework for addressing these weather and water-related disruptions and instability. And in the initial phase of the project, we hosted a workshop with key analysts and decision makers from across relevant US government agencies and additional related organizations, and explored 3 case studies: the Horn of Africa, South Asia, specifically Pakistan, and the Caribbean, in order to better understand the broader compound risks posed by climate change and identify entry points for action, response, and building resilience and peace. So the main questions this initiative sought to address is what is needed to construct early warnings and take proactive action on these issues, what physical, social, and economic impacts may arise from cascading, clustered, or sequential extreme events, and how can we facilitate coordination between elements of the defense and intelligence community with regional experts and practitioners. And so early findings for the workshop discussion and the project identified a framework that consists of 3 main tipping points on which to focus in order to understand these compound risks. So the first of these is these ecosystemic tipping points. For example, these can be seen as increasingly frequent and severe hurricanes in the Caribbean, combined with high levels of coastal populations that are at risk of subsequent flooding and sea level rise, and also persistent droughts that are becoming more intense and frequent across the region. The next tipping point is transnational risks. In the case of Pakistan, that's boundary disputes. So, for example, the country predominantly relies on one source of water, the Indus River, which is shared with India. And so between the 2 countries, the Indus Waters Treaty is in place to foster coordination over the shared water resource. However, a changing climate may pose challenges to the treaty, as it does not account for variability in river flow and could exacerbate tensions with India. And the final tipping point we found was political and societal instability. So in the case of East Africa, it looks like domestic insurgency, which can be exemplified, just a few examples, through the presence of violent extremist organizations, ongoing farmer-herder violence, and high levels of youthful populations, combined with high levels of unemployment rates. So overall, by examining these different entry points, we can better understand the existing vulnerabilities and risk that could impact future environmental changes and also be exacerbated by these changes. And so taking this framework, we wanted to examine a new location that had vulnerabilities that aligned with the framework and apply it to expand and refine our analysis. So we decided to host another private workshop and public event that included key analysts, security experts, US government representatives, and regional experts and stakeholders. And so the workshop focused on the Pacific region and specifically what these risks meant for the Compact of Free Association, or COFA states, which includes Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. And so the Pacific region has combined geographic and climatic complexities, which made it an interesting case for better understanding the compound climate security threats and further informing the framework. It's highly exposed to ongoing and future climate impacts. There's great power competition in the region between the US and China, and there are existing political and social vulnerabilities that could be exacerbated in response to environmental changes. So after the second workshop, we were able to better refine the framework and redefine the tipping points. So those ecosystemic shocks as physical and natural systems vulnerabilities, the transnational tipping point as transboundary and regional dynamics, and then further political and social instability. But we are also able to add an additional tipping point, which is scales of decision-making. And by having scales, having the scale adds a dimension to the framework and demonstrates that each of the original 3 tipping points and responses to them impacts governance at all scales, from international dimensions to regional decision-making to national and state level and to the local community decision-making. The impacts at one level of decision-making could have implications across all scales, and knowing that is immensely helpful, especially as we for improving predictive capabilities, they must be developed with a recognition of the scale at which they will be implemented and what consequences could arise across all of them. And focusing on scale also provides an entry point for understanding local, state, and transnational vehicles for accomplishing goals, and provides space for including traditional knowledge and solutions and inclusive strategies for building resilience. So now our goal is to take this framework and apply it to the Central American context, specifically looking at countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and assess how mobility interacts with the pre-existing physical and natural systems vulnerabilities, transboundary and regional dynamics, political and social instability, and how decision-making at all scales influences overall stability and responses to climate risk. So given this framework and the desire to continue finding entry points for building resilience and peace, today's discussion will look at the following questions. So what are the physical, social, and economic impacts that may arise from cascading, clustered, or sequential extreme weather events in Central American countries, so Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador? Who are the actors that must be engaged in this process? And how can we facilitate coordination between different communities of practice with regional experts and practitioners? What are the needed institutional mechanisms for enabling safe sanctioned migration as an adaptation strategy? And what role can environmental peacebuilding play in improving our ability to respond and build resilience to these challenges and opportunities? So thank you for joining us and being a part of this discussion. I know there's a lot to go with, but for more information on the broader project, I'm going to include a link to our policy brief in the chat that explains more. So thank you again.
Thanks, Amanda. I didn't think you could do it, but you did it. All of the research.
I just want to say yay to Amanda. That was an excellent presentation, Amanda.
Oh, thank you, Sherry.
Really
Perfect.
Captured 5 years of work in 5 minutes. That's really
yeah. No easy task.
No, it was great. And I'm sure there will be questions. But first, we wanted to talk a little bit about where the project stands in terms of understanding these dynamics in the context of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And as we are applying this framework to that region, one of the main goals is to understand how migration dynamics and different levels of violence interact with these climate risks and what that means for our responses. We've hosted, we're about halfway through our project here and have done some digging into the specific climate dynamics in the region and the migration dynamics in the region. And I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Brady, who's going to just take a few minutes to share some of the initial findings.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And thanks, Amanda, for a really good lead in to this current focus. So actually, when we were just meeting before this started, we were talking about the weather and the fact that Amanda is currently shoveling, I think, something like 13 inches of snow off of her driveway. So in any case, I was going to start my remarks today reflecting that for all of us on this call today, no matter where we are in the world, we have all seen this steady uptick in the number of headlines and our own experiences around the really devastating impacts of extreme weather, wildfires, floods, severe hurricanes, record-breaking heat and cold spells. And a lot of these are forcing people to move. So I think it's fair to say that there's a growing recognition that climate change is going to affect security, and it's increasingly shaping people's decisions about where to move, where to live, and how to plan their futures. But how migration, climate, and insecurity connect and drive risks is not always as clear-cut as the headlines would have us believe. We all know that there's very rarely one thing driving a person's decision to move. There are always multiple push and pull factors, and generally it's a combination of those things. While environmental factors and specifically climate change are rarely understood to be the primary reasons for migration, the trajectory of climate change and its specific influence on migration from the region we're talking about today, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, is really significant. In the context of our project, as Amanda described, we are now focusing on Central America, and we devoted the first 2 workshops in our series to really focusing on the dynamics of migration as well as climate risk analytics for the region. So I thought I would quickly share just a couple of key things that we have learned so far. The first, which will be a surprise to no one, is that it's really critical to take a systems view that allows us to see the truly dynamic and interdependent nature of all of the various risks and resiliencies. Second, we know that mobility has long been a core component of adaptation in the Central America region, and it absolutely can be a successful and peaceful means of climate adaptation into the future if it is enabled by smart policy. And unfortunately, simplistic narratives about migrants can obscure the opportunities as well as prompt misdirected responses. Certainly in the Central American context, political, economic, and social dynamics are as important to understanding vulnerability and resilience as exposure to the physical effects of climate change. And with that in mind, I wanted to share with you a couple of the key takeaways around migration in this region that we've pulled out of the project so far. So I will just run through those. The first is, again, not a surprise to anyone who works on the region, but governance challenges are an all-encompassing reality for Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. The history of autocratic rule, chronic lack of investment in public institutions, and corruption have fueled a pervasive distrust in government and a truly omnipresent level of insecurity. Many citizens are unwilling to interact with the state, and that limits the ability of those states to respond, as well as the ability of people to access the resources that they need to address their own insecurity. And those dynamics are essential to the migration trends that we see from the region. Since individual decisions to move are highly contextual and localized, securitization of migration is a really inappropriate policy response. Mobility cannot be treated as a cross-border security risk without also acknowledging that the movement of people in this region has always been a really critical adaptive and resilient capacity. And it's in no small measure a result of the very real and persistent social, economic, and political inequities in these countries, which I'm sure we'll discuss more of today. This region is plagued by high levels of poverty, inequality, insecurity, and fragile democratic institutions, as well as extreme levels of chronic violence, which have an enormous effect on individual decisions to move. Impunity and violence continue to impact nearly every facet of daily life for many people, and the governments in the region struggle to provide the functional legal, judicial, and correctional institutions, which might otherwise change that trajectory. Demographic trends, such as the growing youth population and a very weak formal sector employment set of options, alongside of urbanization, are straining government infrastructure and service delivery, which impacts the physical security and well-being of people, and is often taking an extra toll on the most vulnerable groups. Notably, the increase in recent border crossings to the US is almost entirely accounted for by families traveling together and unaccompanied minors, which demonstrates the shift towards more at-risk and vulnerable groups who are migrating from the region. And lastly, recurrent environmental challenges, not least the back-to-back extreme weather events that have triggered multiple natural disasters in recent years, reduces adaptive capacity, drains resources, and undermines both societal and institutional resilience. So as both Amanda and Lauren mentioned, the goal of these workshops is to improve the application of predictive capabilities and align work across communities of practice to identify shared priorities and hopefully meaningful entry points for action. So with that in mind, I wanted to emphasize from the migration perspective that effective action in the region means enabling safe migration, avoiding forced displacement and poorly managed movement, and ensuring the security of all people. including the potentially trapped populations or people who actually lack the resources or capabilities to move. And to do that, we have to keep part of our focus on resilience of both people and the systems that we've been talking about. As we continue this conversation today, I wanted to encourage everyone to really think about not just the sources of threat or vulnerability in this region, but to really focus on trying to identify what you see as sources of strength and where there are capacities that could be better enabled and supported or even shored up by external support. It's going to be critical to finding solutions that will be locally grounded and relevant and can withstand not only the impacts of a changing climate, but all the other stresses that we have yet to foresee. And I know that Roger and Sherry will speak to lots of those. So I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Sherry, as somebody who has been working in this space for, a few decades, and as somebody who's been leading in the thinking and on the policy and working within a major institution within the United States on the intersection of environment and security, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this project has informed your thinking about this shift from a focus on environmental security to also looking at environmental peace building, recognizing where we are sitting today, and the framing of the current focus on Central America in that context. So just reflecting a little bit on your career and how you see this fitting into a long legacy of leadership in this space.
Well, thank you very much, Lauren. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I see many good friends and colleagues on this call. So I think of this, and those are great remarks, Cynthia and Amanda, it's really well done. The original environmental security framing, which goes back to the 1990s, was developed as a way to bring environment and environmental considerations into our broader understanding of national and international security at that time, when the subject was largely absent or when it was simply limited to cleaning up pollution at bases, but not in the context of global environmental change. And security is often defined through the lens of threats and risks and reducing instability, which can lead to conflict. So, but we know now that the absence of direct armed conflict doesn't necessarily itself produce stability. So it's not an either or question. And I think back a lot now as we've, I think, migrated the concept of environmental security with a threat-based focus to environmental peace building with more of an opportunity-based focus. I think back to a concept that we connected, what we then called environmental security in the 1990s, with a defense concept by my former boss, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, called preventive defense. And preventive defense in the early post-Cold War era was defined as using the capabilities of national security and the military in particular to promote democracy, to promote trust among partners and allies, and civilian control of the military. And it had a very positive cast. Of course, we've long left those halcyon days of the early post-Cold War, and our tools have expanded. But I think of peace building as a sort of today's view of how we can more positively engage, recognizing the broader set of tools we have available. So now, if we bring in sort of climate and ecosystem change as the sort of second element of it, we know that climate is both a now today problem and a future problem. We know the examples of extreme weather being regularly disruptive. I mean, Amanda's dealing with that. We're all dealing with it where we live, but most of us here have the benefit of being in operating from a relatively stable place, even if we're temporarily disrupted. But that's not always the case in the regions we're talking about. So we need to bring that extra element of dynamic change. And third, the idea of migration as positive adaptation in certain circumstances resonates so deeply with me personally. And that's why I think, what we're trying to do here in understanding how how to address migration within the region and understand, particularly make security and intelligence forces and others understand that broader concept. And I think a lot of what we've talked about, a lot of what Amanda and Cynthia already briefed, you can see embedded in the Climate National Intelligence Estimate already, and in the Department of Defense Climate Risk Analysis and in other documents of this administration. But I'll end with my own sort of personal story, which is my parents were Holocaust refugees, and they were among the fortunate few that had relatives that could help them come to the United States when they needed to flee Germany in the 1930s. And so they weren't subject to forced displacement. They had, although it was highly disruptive and they came here with nothing, they were able to, successfully adapt into American life. But, so many weren't, and so many aren't able to today. So facilitating that, obviously in our own country, that means addressing how we deal with immigration policy, but also addressing the local needs within the region and better understanding that. And it's been one of my missions and passions to kind of inform the security community with a more textured and nuanced understanding of that at the level where decisions are made within commands, because I do believe that security and military forces can be, in certain circumstances, positive aids to peace building as a support element when properly mobilized and when they have the right context.
Thank you, Sherry. That was great. And I think it's kind of a helpful sort of framing for this overall discussion. Roger, you have your hands in a lot of buckets, I'd say, in climate security and humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and risk reduction and international development. I think, it would be great to hear how you've seen these fields evolve to better account for the complex ways that climate change interacts with livelihoods, peace and security, and governance systems, thinking about the context of the current focus of Central America.
Perfect. No, thanks. Just as a statement up front, the types of things we're hearing are actually filtering into broader global mechanisms, such as how nations around the world are trying to respond in the context of disaster risk reduction and the Sendai framework. The Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement are all struggling with getting their heads around precisely the questions that we're talking about. What is reliable? Where does it fall? Who makes the decisions? And who makes decisions on whose behalf? So as we begin to hear all of the different pieces, and we heard from Cynthia, really this critical effort on harmonizing the related sort of climate, migration, and security agenda across the board, certainly from Sherry and my notes here on the need and for integrated information, physical, social, and the consequences of interventions to become more accessible. In that context, we're actually asking the question, how best do we understand the diverse ways in which people do or do not become mobile? How do we understand what is needed to include populations who are affected, and to understand not just where they are, but where they go in the context of things we were just hearing? And to that extent, just as a quick recap, as many people would know, Central America has been identified by the IPCC and others as possibly the most sensitive region in the world to a changing climate in the context of multiple hazards and risks. And as we think through that, you can certainly see the recent warm years, but not just that, hurricanes Eta and Iota in 2020, but also a long-standing drought from 2013 to 2016 that affected food security as well. And we know from the World Food Program in 2019, on-the-ground assessment basically showed that about 30% of the people who said that they were migrating or moving or were displaced identified a link to food security driven by droughts and floods as a key thing. Now, in years of doing work on agricultural systems and how actions filter into economies and the environments, we estimate that for every one person affected, 3 are in fact dependent on what that one person does, whether it's mechanics, gas stations, and so on. So that actually we know to be the case. So the question is, this didn't just arise yesterday. Risks are cumulative over time. And so understanding the cascading risks, how they propagate, has become a central issue in understanding how we move from risk to resilience. And in that sense, in 2020, the Coordination Center for Prevention of Disasters in Central America and Dominican Republic, CEPREDANAC, which I've worked with for years, developed SICA, the COVID information system. With CATALAC, the Central American Climate Forum, the Regional Hydrologic Resources Committees, and so on. But most critically, the World Meteorological Organization, the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, began to align their regional training centers and so on, working with small communities in the region. And in fact, we just released the regional assessment report showing how some of these activities have aligned. But we know, however, that that doesn't mean that capabilities to respond are being embedded. And I think in that setting, as we begin to think about systemic risks that affect people, this key issue that yes, there are weather, climate, and other signals that influence the environmental change on drivers of mobility, we try to uncover where is it exposure to the hazard, the damage to ecosystem services and land productivity, the economic drivers on employment. And we know from years of work now that it's not just about employment, and also the reasons why people return. So in that setting, we began to coordinate a series of activities around information systems, around climate services, working with these identified communities and focusing on food and water security. But for all of those things, the idea of what creates not just proactive, but prospective risk management, the ability not to let new hazards and disasters arise, become very critical in this region. And we can identify all the issues surrounding corruption, governance, information systems, but also the need to act. What triggers movement is not always predictable. The general frame can help us, the root causes can help us think through it, but what triggers that many times are linked to some of the physical systems, the damage surrounding how a hazard becomes a disaster. So key areas that have been identified for action, of course, is large-scale restoration of agricultural landscapes managed by small farmers, the restoration of key ecosystems, urban climate risk reduction, especially surrounding new risks associated with heat and heat stress, and of course, energy development activities that respects the rights of indigenous people and local communities. And that's the way these coordinated activities are getting at disaster risk in the context of preserving people's ability to make choices and aligning the funds. But the most critical thing is to strengthen and integrate the territorial instrumentation and flows of information across different communities, vertically and horizontally, globally to local and locally back up, and then horizontally within watersheds and understanding the risks therein. Most critical among that, is to create the shared vision that in fact, people have the wherewithal to make choices about their own lives, and how best we support that through information, knowledge, and funding becomes critical. So I want to transition to Ileana to get us a sense of where some of these, the many things you've heard are playing out on the ground, and how we think about the territorial view of knowledge, information, and planning. So thanks, Lauren.
Well, thank you. And well, I thank you for the organizers for inviting me into this conversation. First of all, I wanted to clarify that I haven't been a part of this project, but I wanted to share some insights to especially around the framework that they propose that particularly draw on this, as Roger was talking about, how do we go from assessing risk into governance? And drawing specifically from research that we have conducted on governance issues linked to natural resources and resource tenure, in particular in the countries of Guatemala and Honduras. And as you could see from Amanda's presentation and how the framework around climate risks focus on how we assess risk and identifying the pathways to understand better how these play out on the ground. But one thing that we have learned is that when we talk about Central America and the Northern Triangle countries in particular, we're talking about multiple crises. We're talking about not only social, but also environmental conditions, physical conditions that increase population's vulnerability to be affected by extreme weather events and other climate change related risks. The truth is that structural aspects, as were shared by Cynthia, in terms of inequality, governance instability, insecurity, that favor vulnerability and increased vulnerability conditions are not experienced by social groups in the same way. For instance, in particular, populations at risk, women, indigenous peoples, may not only have the same exposure to risk, but also would have different approaches to how to respond to it. So from our work, one of the aspects that we have highlighted is the importance of ensuring resource access and tenure, and how this links to the availability and the possibility of developing livelihoods. For instance, the 3 countries that are part of the Northern Triangle, the role that agriculture plays, not necessarily in terms of GDP or in terms of income. We know that historically, during the last years, the 3 countries have decreased, in particular, the proportion of their GDP that relies on agriculture. But the amount of people that actually depend on this sector makes, the importance and highlights the importance of putting resource access also in the center of our assessment of climate risks. However, as we see the climate change agenda and how these countries are approaching the climate change agenda, there has been historically a larger focus on mitigation actions, and not necessarily until very recently, and in particular because of the extreme events that the region has suffered, an increasing focus on adaptation and resilience. That is something very important, especially if we want to address not only the enabling conditions, but also in terms of how the different social groups respond to this type of events. One of the things that I would like to share with you is how, in particular, 2 experiences in Guatemala and Honduras that actually help us to understand what role can environmental governance and territorial governance in particular could have in our assessment of risk and our responses to it. For instance, the Guatemalan case, especially the way the Guatemalan government decided to, as part of the peace accords, recognize rights to local communities that were based in forest resources, have actually gave way to a landmark case that became an example of how recognition of rights can be a key strategy for attaining environmental peace building. In the northern region of Petén, around 500,000 hectares are under the management of communities, which not only have helped maintain a close to zero deforestation rate in the region, but also have generated a series of benefits, including employment, organization, income that has been invested in health, livelihoods, and food security, that has actually reduced the rates of migration in comparison to other regions in the country. This is not a small issue, as we're talking about Petén, which is a region that has been marked considerably by conditions of violence. However, if we compare this case to the region of the Mosquitia region in the Honduras coast, where the Honduran government has recognized rights to indigenous peoples, this process of recognition has not been accompanied by a process of capabilities of ensuring the enabling conditions that allow communities to promote territorial governance, and have actually is actually putting at risk a process in which local organizations, and in particular indigenous communities, can not only be able to address risk conditions, as the recent hurricanes that hit the Mosquitia coast recently, but also is putting at risk the efforts for reaching environmental governance in the region. So I would highlight 3 lessons from these 2 case studies. For instance, the first one, the importance of recognizing rights in particular territorial rights, and how to what extent those rights can actually play a role in the process in which we deal with climate risks. A second, the importance of strengthening capacities. This is actually in the core of the framework that has been proposed. And finally, ensuring the enabling conditions are in place, talking about the institutional structures, the political will, the long-term livelihood and conservation benefits that should be part and in the core of how we develop and we address pathways to address climate risks. I think a framework that allows to not only place in these 4 different dimensions, as colleagues have been sharing, but also having a better understanding of how these play out at the territorial level could inform, especially in a region as diverse as the Northern Triangle, processes in which we can not only develop a framework that informs our understanding how to develop pathways and inform processes, but also to support already governance processes happening on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ileana. That was, it was really helpful to have a couple of examples and sort of glean some of the lessons from those examples. I want to make sure that you all feel comfortable coming. You can either raise your hand and come off of mute or share questions in the chat box. Roger, Amanda, Sherry, or Cynthia, do you have any sort of reflections on what Ileana just shared or follow-up questions before we open it up? I think one of the challenges, opportunities, one of the things we're thinking about is at which level of decision-making entry points can be effective. And one of the things that stands out to me in the region that we're focused on is what you were saying, Ileana, about the diversity across the region, right? And how different communities are connected to the land that they're on, and how some of that sort of supersedes their maybe sort of national connections, but also the regional frameworks in place to deal with some of the challenges or respond to disasters, and thinking about how to link up decision-making so that you're not unintentionally undermining the interests of the community on the ground, and are able to sort of incorporate their expertise, their knowledge into some of the higher levels of decision-making. I wonder if you, in your work, have seen lessons shared across the region, and what kind of coordination you've seen in civil society or NGOs or folks working a little bit closer to the ground, but also engaging outside of their community.
Thank you for the question, Lauren. Actually, I think that's quite relevant, especially when we talk about climate change and climate risk. One of the things that we're seeing, especially from the forest world, is that our focus on climate change issues in general are very sectorial. If you see, like, for instance, when we talk about, attention to risk, then you will find a number of actors from the government, from civil society, that are going to be coming from a specific sector. If you want to talk about, climate change actions linked to mitigation, there will be another set of factors, and so on. If you talk about adaptation, even if you talk about, issues to how do you address our attention to disaster. So it's very difficult to bring these different sectors, not only collaborating and coordinating. And I think this framework that you're proposing would allow to bring in not only across sectors, but also, as it's being proposed, across multi-level governance, to strengthen multi-level governance. From what we're seeing on the ground, especially from research, that's why our focus is at the territorial level. We're observing that, it's easier to engage these different, crossing the boundaries of cross-sectoral work, and promoting more collaboration, or at least more coordination, bringing different civil societies, organizations and territorial organizations that are all experiencing similar issues. And that allows, we consider, more chances for these discussions to come up, for these silos to be overcome, especially as there is propositions from the territories coming into the national level. More work at that level, we think would favor better policies in terms of how they address these differences across the territories, and especially when we're trying to attend how similar problems will have different responses or different forms of experiencing the impacts whenever you take it down at that territorial level.
Yeah, no, that's great. The sort of horizontal learning as well as Roger, go ahead. And then I'm going to come to you, Shiloh.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of reinforce Ileana's point about the systemic nature of complex disasters, right? And a disaster being the thing that overwhelms a community's capability to respond to a hazard. And so in that setting, the single event type of approach, of course, is failing us because risk is accumulated over time. That's how thresholds and tipping points occur. So I do want to keep in mind her point that the integrative view is a systemic view, how multiple events, multiple stresses compound and cascade. The second point on governance, which is extremely critical, and the role of territorial actors along with public institutions and civil society is actually one of procedural equity in who is included and how. But in the context of rational equity, which is, you know, basically rational trust, well, how reliable is my information, versus procedural, who is engaged, there's the idea of affinitive trust, which is, why do I believe that you are on my side? And this has been one of the biggest breakdowns in trying to implement broader integrated approaches to governance and risk. So the space in which we begin to understand each other's values, what we want and who is affected, is conditioned by how do we develop that link and trust that says we have each other's back here. That's not always the case. So I just want to make sure that we're getting to some of Ileana's key points. Thanks.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that that's something that I know that in the U.S. government, USAID has announced that they want to be providing I think it's like 25% of their funding directly to communities on the ground in the next 4 or 5 years, and then upping that over the course of the decade. And but making sure that the communities and local groups and civil society and local leaders have the capacity to be able to engage. Roger, you're muted.
You're reading my mind. There's a great study by, I forget the group, they're called the Wilson Center, I think, that really identifies that so much of what we're talking about when we get on the ground to implementation, we bring in external actors, consultants and folks, and local capacity is not usually what we're after. So I just, that procedural aspect is important. So thanks.
Yeah. Shiloh, over to you. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Great discussion. Thanks so much to everyone. Much to follow up on, but I just wanted to ask to what extent this study or others of your work, perhaps Ileana in particular, are looking at the climate migration security nexus in urban contexts in North and Central America? And if so, what sorts of things are you finding in that space? Thanks.
That's a great question. Ileana, go ahead.
Thank you. No, thank you for the question. I just wanted to give a quick comment. I think that's very relevant, especially as I think colleagues were talking about the importance of looking at the different forms of migration, right? The importance of mobility. And actually, what we're seeing on the ground is that there is a process. Of course, not everybody is experiencing the risks and the climate change in the same way. Not everybody is able to respond in the same way. And there seems to be kind of a continuum, right? In terms of how the mobility process takes place. And of course, that continuum might change, especially if it's a single extreme event versus, we're not talking, I mean, as Roger was talking about in previously, the longer periods of droughts. So I think it's also looking at the type of event that is affecting and the type of responses. What we're seeing on the ground, especially, I'm referring to Guatemala, but I think it's also happening in Honduras, is that you're seeing in particular territories that are more strongly affected. For instance, the data that I remember the best is when ETA and IOTA happened, we're talking about more than around 1 million people being affected only in Guatemala. And Guatemala is not even close to the coast as comparison to Nicaragua and Honduras. So you might think, why that large number? And when you're looking at the territory that was affected and how the event, it was 1 month event, in terms between ETA and IOTA and what happened in the middle. And you were seeing that there was the northern strip, which is kind of like the area that is crossing from Honduras into Mexico, that was extremely affected. That's an area where you have a major flow of rivers. You were seeing floods, you were seeing, communities completely underwater, lost agriculture. And then afterwards, you start seeing cases, of movement, of displacement of movement into urban areas. Because for the first, in terms of the response, that's where the shelters were. That's one thing. So, all of the attention is being focused on the urban area, and therefore the displacement is happening there. But then you're seeing in the shelters that some of the groups, are being affected in different ways. Like, for instance, women, not being as prone to go to the shelters because they would be, we're talking about COVID times, we're talking about increasing violence. And, the attention at the urban center needed to take a more nuanced approach in terms of the different groups and how these different groups were happening. So especially in the urban areas and not looking months after the events, but actually what's happening, we're seeing an increase in urban population, in urban sprawl, in terms of labors, changes in the type of labor, especially for women and agricultural laborers, talking about indigenous peoples. And in increasing violence, especially for areas like we were analyzing data and different types of violence, of course, and those that are being targeted by that type of violence. So I think that there is not enough data. I think there needs to be a stronger effort into focusing what's going on at the urban areas, and also looking at how the process of mobility and the continuum, of how that mobility is happening, where I think further attention would be important. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ileana. Shiloh, that's a really good question. Did you want to respond?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Okay. And it's actually, a few handful of years ago, we produced a discussion paper on looking at the connections between climate change, migration, and conflict. And one thing that Cynthia and Amanda and I have been thinking about how to be updating that. And one of the gaps we realized in that initial research was leaving out sort of the urban context and this recognition that we do live in an urban world at this point, and the trends are going to continue towards urbanization, and that so many of the cities have, a lot of the sort of peri-urban areas are lacking the basic access to essential services that are needed. And that's going to become more stressed as climate impacts increase. And I think, it's true that there's definitely not enough data. One thing that we've recognized, though, is that there is a lot of learning at the city level. And this sort of thing, there are lots of sort of mayor networks, right? And so having an ability to tap into the expertise at the city level and bring those insights to bear in different contexts, I think is certainly a way forward. Cynthia, do you want to add to that?
Only maybe just to echo Lauren's point that we know that a lot of people move to cities or peri-urban areas, and yet we don't have nearly as much focus on what can be done in advance to prepare for the increasing movements of people for new and additional reasons than may have come in the past. And I was actually on a panel last week with a mayor and a person who works on these issues in Mechelen, Belgium. And it's an incredible opportunity to learn from cities where proactive efforts have been made over the last decade to really try to constructively integrate and support newly arriving people. And as we look at this nexus of issues, climate, migration, and insecurity only getting stronger into the future, I think that focus on understanding where things have actually worked that can be applied elsewhere, scaled up, and lessons can be transferred, especially in cities, makes a lot of sense. So we hope that this work can pick up on that as well.
Sam Sellers, over to you.
Many thanks, Lauren, and thanks for a wonderful discussion, and apologies as I joined a bit late. You know, I know this is an environmental peace building conference and session, and so that's the lens through which a lot of these discussions are being had. I guess I'm wondering, perhaps it's my own nature, to be a little bit skeptical of some of what's promised. That are we being overly optimistic in terms of our thinking and ability to change the conditions on the ground? A lot of what's been discussed are these push factors related to migration, the climate and conflict, and how those interact in complex systems. I take Roger's point that community-centered approaches may help to ameliorate some of these pressures better than previous types of interventions. But global inequality continues to be a powerful driver for migration, and that's not going to change. And we're seeing in the US labor market right now shortages and long-term demographic challenges. And so I'm wondering, I currently am contracting for USAID, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the organization, but I know there's some other aid folks on the call, and I'm wondering, is USAID and our other federal agencies that are being charged to work in the Northern Triangle to prevent and help ameliorate some of these problems, are we being given an impossible task if the framing is about dealing with push factors and trying to increase local resilience rather than dealing with the pull factors, which are still going to be there and aren't going away anytime soon?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from others in the call. I will say, Sam, that we're definitely, we will not be stopping migration, nor do we want to. I think we recognize that migration has forever been a really an important adaptation strategy. And it's so for the framing of this project, it's really about how do you ensure that the conditions on the ground allow for people to have a choice in whether or not they move. And so I would just make that note. So we're, sort of that, I think Cynthia said, enabling safe and sanctioned migration and avoiding displacement would be the goal. And you're absolutely right that just demographically, it's good for the US to have migrants, and it's good for Europe to have migrants. It's just ensuring that it's done, that people aren't forced to do it in unsafe conditions. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that. Otherwise, I will turn it to Salim. Hi, welcome. Good to see you.
Yes, greetings. Thank you. So yes, this was a question which we also were grappling with in our report for the International Resource Panel that I talked about earlier today. And we were actually going to have a deep dive case on Latin America in the report, which the steering committee of the panel, that includes the United States as well, really wanted. And what we found based on the field data we were able to get from colleagues at IOM and UNEP is that the argument is not compelling at all that the international migration to the United States from that region is driven by resource security. And I think what Sam was getting at in terms of the pull factors economically are so much overriding that it would be disingenuous of us to even try to make that argument. So I think what was compelling is that domestically within those countries, rural-urban migration, certain kinds of other movements within countries, locations, those are definitely being driven, especially in Honduras, other places as well. And those can lead to political instability. They can lead to other factors, certainly. So, this goes to the complex systems approach, which is important to highlight. And the international migration question should be framed, I think, along those larger lines of global inequality, labor needs, and so on. And we should try to, the environmental questions should be demarcated based on the data. And so that's all I would request that the community continues to do.
Thank you, Salim. Salim, do you have a link to your report that you could put in the chat?
The report will be launched in April. So it hasn't, okay. We haven't publicly launched it, but I gave a summary presentation. So it's a report for the International Resource Panel that is a UN mandated panel. And it'll be available. I'll put the link to the panel's website here. So sometime towards the middle to end of April. It's quite a large report, and we have several collaborators from all over the world in it. And our focus is to really consider the role of natural resources as a mediating force between climate change and global environmental change and human mobility. And we looked at a range of factors, like, for example, mineral resources. We looked at hydroelectric development resources. And
that's great.
We looked at land degradation, soil issues, and also.
Okay, congratulations. We'll look forward to that. Ileana, Cynthia, Sherry, Roger, Amanda, any of you want to chime in? Roger, go ahead.
Oh no, if anybody wants to, I want to comment on the last two comments. One is, I think Sam is absolutely correct. This is an overwhelming problem. And we have to distinguish between tinkering and action. And your point about the choice aspects of dignity, right? Dignity being the ability to make and capability to make a choice about the future of your own lives safely and equitably is actually what we're after. So I think that's a big, but when it comes to saying, do we stop, stymie, or manage migration, I'm fully in agreement. On the urban question, there has been, most of the displacement we've seen around the world has been within countries, not necessarily transborder unless you're on the border. And part of the systemic view is to also understand not how new opportunities or risks are created when people move to a city, but then how that city relies on external networks globally as well, from ports, trade, commodities, and so on. To the resource question, I don't think we're being as environmentally deterministic as you might be indicating, Salim. This is not the point. The point is whether or not we're actually seeing manageable triggers in the context of the longer term drivers of equity, economics, and the pull as well. And one of those pulls is really about corruption and about security. And so what we want to be able to say again is not simply what's the driver, where's the climate trigger? It's no way that linear. So the critique in the sense is setting up a straw man that is not the one that we have. The issue is in the context of these major factors, what triggers movement, even within a country. And from that standpoint, this is not environmental determinism. We're not saying these resources lead to this action, but instead, where and how a choice is made, how can we better inform those? And the labor organizations, World Food Program, and others have identified food security as one of those things that actually drive about 30% of the movement, displacement. It doesn't have to be complete migration that we're seeing. So I want to be clear that, to step back from that is the sort of the sort of broader environmental determinism of the link to resources is not necessarily what we're after. It's more a case of how choices are made in the context of changing environments, which include resources. And I could tell you that exactly from a set of empirical studies on migration that occurred during the 2017 hurricane season across the Caribbean and how internal migration took place. And then also issues surrounding certainly food, jobs, security as the main driver, but also the role of water scarcity in Venezuela for helping to precipitate dry at a particular point. So the question is, there are the larger drivers. We're also looking at the cross-scale issue of what triggers movement as well, given those larger systemic and root causes.
Yeah, no, I agree with that part about the trigger, but even on the triggers, you have to be very careful about the extreme weather events you've noted, those are appropriate notes, but for international migration, which is where the policy conversation is most acutely framed, both in the United States and in Europe, you will find that the triggering impacts are actually far greater in terms of in-migration policy, are far greater triggers than anything even remotely that could be sensitive at that level. So extreme weather events, earthquakes, those are absolutely going to create sudden disruptions. But I think we're on the same page. I'm just saying,
I agree.
I mean, I'm talking about the common people when they read it, New York Times story, it is not framed appropriately. And
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more on that. And in fact, part of this effort was what really is the traceable account and what happens when you cannot produce a traceable. So I fully agree with you that the way it's being represented is more deterministic than we're doing. There's one thing that, and Sherry knows more about this than I do, in the context, and I've worked on this in East Africa, within country migration is also a security issue for the US. And that's part because you don't want to be drawn into places of crisis. So there is exactly the point you're making about the transnational and who moves where, but there's also an issue surrounding where we're pulled in the security arena into places. And we see it actually not just in East Africa, but also in the Pacific as well. So I want to just add that other directional thing. But I think we're not only on the same page, we're in the same book. It's just that how it's communicated, I couldn't agree with you more, that it's described in strictly deterministic ways that actually undermines the things the Chilo and others were saying about how we think about networks and how we think about cities and so on. So I actually think it gets in the way. It doesn't help. So thanks.
There's Jill, I'm going to come to you in just a minute. There's a question in the chat reflecting on what Sherry said about the field moving away from the idea of climate environmental security, which implies dealing with risk, to peace building. She says, however, as we all know, the field of climate security is inextricably tied to national security. Climate environmental peace building implies concepts of justice, equity, etc., while security implies a need to fend off risks to a country's security. Can the panelists comment on how they see this evolving discourse?
Okay, thank you. That's a good
you want to
question.
go first, Sherry? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I think the concepts of environmental and climate security are still very much valid. I do think, however, that as the military and other security actors better understand both climate and governance risks, they can be better supporting players with other, with the diplomatic, development, disaster risk, humanitarian communities, since they are often the ones with the capabilities, whether it's, agricultural specialists helping, regrow Afghanistan, or providing logistic support, or search and rescue relief, or humanitarian aid in the wake of a natural disaster. So I think it's a both and. You have to walk and chew gum. When the best military commanders, always when I've worked with a lot of them, when they're going to a new region, they start about reading about the history and the geography of where they're going to be, because they want to understand, what's the background? What are the conditions? What's the history of the people, the governance? Okay, and now you have to add into that, I think, the fact that it's not just geography, but it's also the climate, the environmental and climate changes, the ecosystem changes that are changing the security and political dynamic of the region. And that's why, part of the DoD's climate adaptation plan is to develop a climate literate force. And that means not just for people who are base commanders. Yes, okay, that might be obvious. But it means for people who are, let's say, the military planners at Southcom, which works with, in Latin America, and not just the military sort of warfighting planners, but those who are doing engagement and partnerships, because the broader concept of security is about working with allies and partners and diffusing crises and tension before they occur. And also the understanding that it's no longer federal or even official actors in many regions, officially blessed actors that are the ones that wield the power in society. So understanding that it makes other organizations better able to support long-term objectives for the people most directly affected.
That's great, Sherry. Thank you. Yeah, I think that I see environmental peace building as a tool for responding to climate insecurity. And I also think that we have somewhat outdated understanding of what security, at least in the US, I should say, from my perspective in the US, and it's time to update our idea of what constitutes security. And I think COVID has underscored this, certainly over the last couple of years. I think climate change is making that point very clearly. And understanding that something that might be a security risk doesn't necessarily require a military solution. And that's, I think, one of the benefits of environmental peace building, because it allows us to look at insecurity with a broader lens that brings in different communities of practice and sort of expands that toolbox of responses. So I wouldn't say, I don't think that we're going to necessarily move away from this idea of climate security, at least in the short term. But I think it's important to understand what the risks are in order to be able to leverage tools like environmental peace building in the response. But having that conversation that allows us to think beyond sort of, or I guess not just beyond, but military right? And thinking about all of the tools that we have to deploy, including development and diplomacy. I would love for somebody else to chime in.
Jill has her hand raised.
Jill, you've been waiting forever. I just wanted to add one comment on top of that, which is, so I come from the development space. And when I talk about climate security or think about climate security, I certainly acknowledge the hard security dimensions of that. And then also, we're talking about human security, lives, livelihoods, health, well-being. Those are inherent to what this project is about. And hopefully in those early opening remarks, everyone was able to see the way that we're trying to conceptualize the impacts of climate change as certainly not an added layer to existing vulnerabilities, but rather the changing climate is influencing the livelihoods, the agriculture, the way that people are living. So hopefully that framing then makes it more easy to find the ways forward in terms of thinking about not just a set of climate change only technical solutions or science solutions, but rather thinking in a much more integrated way about the ways in which the physical impacts of climate change are affecting existing dynamics of governance, et cetera, and how you can find your points of intervention within that. So I hope that that all is coming back to this idea that our opportunities for addressing the impacts of climate change in this region are wide, and we can think more about opportunities and not just remediating the threats. Jill, I'm sure you were going to say something along those lines too.
Yeah, Jill, over to you.
Hi, first off, thank you so much. This is incredible to get to hear all of you discussing with one another. So no, Cynthia, your points were incredible. I was going to ask a brand new question, if that's okay. I am curious if you can discuss more of what your findings and your questions are about trust and how that fits into the scale of the project. I'm especially wondering, how is your findings or questions drawing out trust on a horizontal level? Because we know that many other things, from climate change to even internal racism, international racism, there's all kinds of dynamics going on and misunderstanding that impact trust horizontally. But then I'm also curious about how, what findings and questions you're asking about trust building across those scales, and especially I think in the intersections on more of the mid-level. I think we do a lot of really, really, really good thinking about how maybe local level connects to national level, but we don't always like think through all the ways that, like all the different channels that goes up through before it finally connects to national levels, all the municipalities involved, all of the state or provincial governments involved, all of the organizations and others. And I'm curious for your thoughts on how trust can be scaled up through those mid levels before it gets on to national and finally international.
Thanks, Jill. I should mention Jill is like an honorary member of the Environmental Change and Security Program as somebody who's been helping us with editing for New Security Beat, our blog. So thank you, Jill. And she's actually, I think you're writing this event up, right? As a summarizing the event for the blog. So you can tune back into that. Thank you. Great question about trust. I'm gonna see if somebody wants to chime in. And Eliana, I know you're not part of this project, but I would love to hear your response based on the work that you are doing in the region as well.
Well, thank you. I think that's trust is actually a very relevant issue, especially if you think about these countries and the history, as it was referred earlier, a history of violence, a history of conflict. Guatemala and El Salvador went civil wars. Honduras was actually affected, by the process and existing violence, different types of violence, right? Derived from the governance and instability issues that we have to deal with. So trust is definitely something that takes time to work on, and it takes effort from the different social actors involved. And I guess, it brings me back to the discussion of territorial governance, and that why we are proposing to start at that level, because I think it allows us to work at a scale that actually allows to bring different social groups and dealing with complex issues and getting a process not only of coordinating and collaborating. I think that takes time, which I would see as important entry points to build that trust. So those would be my 2 cents for that discussion, but thank you. Really important point.
Definitely is. Does anybody else want to chime in on that question?
We often have an expression that, actions move at the speed of trust. That's true regardless of kind of where you sit. So you have to build that trust, even within bureaucracies, even within different American bureaucracies, that trust building is important. So, and then of course it's a larger challenge when you're working across sectors, across decision-making scales, across levels of governance. So that, and of course that's even harder in COVID when you can't sort of make those personal connections, because that's often how the trust is built.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we hosted a session at PeaceCon, I think it was just last week, and had this Miriam Miranda, this really wonderful woman from the Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, on the panel. and she's an activist, an environmental defender, community activist, sort of working to protect the Garifuna community, which is indigenous. Thank you. I know I can. Sorry. Thanks, Roger. And we didn't talk explicitly about trust, but it's clear that it's in some ways, I feel like it has to be a long game, because it's about developing the processes that allow for trust to be built, but recognizing that a lot of the work needs to be done faster than that trust might be able to be built. And Roger, as somebody who's worked in the sort of disaster and sort of acute emergency space, I'd be curious to hear your take on this. And then Salim, I know that you wanted to make a point as well, so I'll come back to you in just a minute. But Roger, go ahead.
Sure. No, thanks. So at least in terms of, ever since we've been doing this work in the context of El Nino and La Nina impacts and the La Nina impacts in Central America and the Caribbean, I'm from the Caribbean, the setting up regional groups that are subsets and mixes of academia, public, private, and so on is something we've been able to do that actually engages local communities on not just bringing voice, but helping design the efforts and projects that are being implemented. There's a lot of lip service given to that kind of approach as well, right? Which is, we think it's trust building when it's just communicating to you that my last paper was the most important thing you should read. And so what we tend to do is build, and I'm not saying this is scaled up at the level that's needed, but a mix of regionally robust collaborative networks of public, private, and civil society folks whose role is to create the space in which this interaction for knowledge exchange takes place, including knowledge exchange up. Now, one of the limiting factors there is not simply listening, but hearing. We create a lot of listening situations in which we don't actually hear. And a lot of the co-production work falls into that category, unfortunately. So what we tend to do is work with people in each of the communities and develop those groups who also share the risk and responsibilities of the same groups that are being affected in the same region. And that's the big effort behind what we've tried to do and learn from El Nino to now. But that collaborative network, I think, is one way in which we get that space in which people get a sense of whether or not they're actually being listened to and they're actually taking part in design in a non-trivial way, not just give me your data, I'll analyze it and you'll be on my paper. That being said, I do want to bring us back to one other thing that happens in being from an island in constrained environments is it might seem straightforward in managing climatic risks where we understand the variability and the change and the extremes, and the projections are one way of thinking about that. But something more important is happening that overwhelms our social systems, which is thresholds and surprises are being reached, not just unfamiliar events, but unprecedented ones that actually overwhelm the lessons that we've learned over time. So I'd be very careful about saying, hey, it's all social. It is a mix of the physical and social environment that we're after. And I think Sherry was making that point.
Thanks, Roger. Salim?
So on the question of trust, I presume you're talking about trust in science also in the broader context of global environmental change. And that's an area I've been working on recently with reference to this notion of science diplomacy and how science can be used for peace building. And there are a few issues we've identified to build trust. One is that the scientific method itself is misunderstood by the public. So when there is uncertainty presented, the public considers that as a way in which the scientists are misleading them, but they're not misleading them. They are just saying this is the way the scientific process works. So I think in order to build trust, we have to have a much more fundamental scientific literacy in the population, which has not happened. And that goes back to our schooling system and all much more deep problems. Second aspect of trust in science has to do with communication of science, which unfortunately has also been lacking at multiple levels. the scientific community itself does not often have the skill set to do it. Journalists are terribly ill-trained. And we've seen that especially with some areas with like nuclear incidents. You ask people in terms of the science of nuclear risk and you get completely outlandish perceptions versus reality. So like Fukushima, for example, was miscommunicated from a scientific perspective. You do a survey of people and people think 12,000 people died of radiation exposure, when in fact, no one died of radiation exposure. It was the tsunami. Yes, there were problems with the radiation exposure. But, so there are a lot of layers of trust. Then you get erosion in technology, not just erosion in science, but in technology, which leads to even greater problems. And then there's the third aspect is that technology itself is misused to erode trust. And we see that with social media, because people are getting so many multiple messages, they don't know what to trust. And so you need filtering mechanisms, you need quality assurance mechanisms. And at one level, social media has been immensely empowering in democratizing, people having their own YouTube channels, great science communicators like Veritasium doing great job. But on the other hand, you have people who are deliberately misusing that. So I think we need a regulatory solution to that aspect of it in terms of misinformation.
Thanks, Elaine. That's really interesting to hear, and a really good point about trust in science as being part of this larger discussion about trust. Thank you. It looks like we're just, I don't know where that hour and a half went, but I think we're at the end of our time. I want to thank all of you for joining the discussion today. I honestly thought we would have like a dozen people around the Zoom on a Friday afternoon at the end of the conference. And so I appreciate the energy that the Environmental Peacebuilding Conference brings, and appreciate your questions and engagement. And it's really great to see a lot of familiar faces. Well, I guess maybe not your faces, but a lot of familiar names on the screen, as well as a lot of new ones. And we look forward to being in touch. So thank you again. And thank you to Ileana and Cynthia, Amanda, Sherry, and Roger, Salim and Jill. Thanks for showing your faces and sharing your comments and questions. Have a great night. Oh, there's another comment. I'm gonna copy the chat box into the Word doc. And so if anybody has any follow-up questions, you can be in touch. I'll put my email in the chat box as well. So if you didn't catch something, let me know. All right, thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend. See you in a couple of years.
Thank you.